Hear me, Kristen? Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. Can you oh whatever.
Right, you're on.
Are we 1 o'clock yet?
1 o'clock right now.
All right, we're gonna wait 1 more minute and then we'll get going. Hello, everybody. It's Brian from Aqua Coat. Today we're gonna talk about the Aqua Coat clear grain filler. Okay. This is water-based, eco-friendly, non-flammable, non-combustible, low odor, low VOC, shelf life greater than a year, and it'll pass 3 freeze-thaw cycles. If you get it to where it seems like it's dried out, as you can see, it's kind of like a gel, almost like a Vaseline. If it seems drier than that, you can add a little bit of water to it and stir it like with a fork, and we'll come back to its consistency. You can use this to finish musical instruments. You can use it for tabletops when you want to get that glass smooth finish and you don't want to put 8 coats of lacquer on it or 10 coats of lacquer. Um, that's what you can use it for. Tabletops, millwork, trim work, cabinets, all sorts of different, anything wooden that's oak or other walnut, some mahogany, some birch. People will put it on different things. You can also add color to it. You can add color with a little bit of water, water soluble trans tints or pigments or dyes. And you would just take a little bit and put it in the container. I would take some out of the container and put it in another container and then add the color. And you can add a little bit of hot water to dilute the color first, and then add the grain filler, like spoon it in, and then till you get your color.
Thank you, Monica, for joining us.
Thank you, Monica. Um, Comes in pints, quarts, and gallons. It goes a very, very long way. A pint would probably do multiple coats on 6 or 8 guitars. And it'll definitely do a big table, multiple coats, not a problem. Um, and what else? You can add color to it.
Hey, Brian, throughout this little presentation, we're going to show you how to do a demo. But if anybody would like to qualify for the sample of the quart of the clear grain filler, please make a comment.
Yep, make a comment, and we're gonna pick people randomly off the list. Um, so here's an example of it's impossible to show how clear the clear grain filler is. I don't even know if this is going to show up because this board is not grain filled and grain filled, but it's so clear and it you can. I don't think it's going to work. Yeah, it's hard to tell, but you can see that if you were sitting here, you could. This is glass smooth, and this has some indentations from from the oak because you can put 5 coats of lacquer on oak and still not get your smoothness as you would have like right here. The one of the most common asked questions is what will it accept or what should I put under it? If you're going to use the water-based stain, okay, you would need a coat of wax-free shellac over it, okay? If you don't, the grain filler will re-wet the water-based stain and rub it and kind of make a smear look to your grain filler, and it won't look as clear or as brilliant. Your coloring won't. So you let it dry a couple hours and then apply a coat of wax-free shellac over it, and then start applying your grain filler. Question?
Yeah, Monica's asking, when do you need sanding sealer first?
So you would need sanding sealer. You could put the sanding sealer instead of like wax-free shellac. You could use the sanding sealer. I said the wax-free shellac because it's a common product. It can't. The wax-free shellac also cannot be like or the water-based sanding sealer cannot be rubbed on either. Again, you'll re-wet it. You can spray it, you can brush it, just don't rub it because you'll just re-wet it and smear it. Okay.
One more from Monica. Can you bleach cabinets and use this product? If so, do you bleach before or after Aqua Coat?
Monica, good question. Give that girl a court. Um, I'm not sure. You would not bleach over the grain filler. That is not going to work. I'm not sure. Monica, send me an email and I'll send you a response. I'll ask my chemist about that. So yeah, so if you're going to put a water-based top coat down or a water-based stain, you'd put your stain on, let it dry a couple hours, then put a wax-free shellac or like a seal coat. If you a water-based seal coat, if you use an oil-based seal coat, you can risk it being incompatible. Okay, if you used if you use a oil-based stain, you can let the stain dry 48 to 72 hours and then apply the grain filler. It won't re-wet the oil-based product. Okay, and then apply 2 to 3 coats of grain filler or whatever. We recommend always running a sample first um, to get your process down. And then as to what will go on top of the grain filler. Okay, so the grain filler is, I could show you how to put it on. It's so clear you really, I mean, you can see that it wets the wood. Can't see that it really.
Quick question from Gary. Brian,
Hey Gary, welcome.
would you stain first or use a grain filler first?
I would stain first because you're staining the wood. Okay, if you put the grain filler on, the grain filler is meant to not let stuff penetrate. Right, it's going to block and seal the pores so that less whatever you're putting on top of it will penetrate. I think it looks much richer if you stain it first. Okay, so here's the grain filler on a little thing. It looks a little white, but once you put it on here, it looked wet, but it didn't look like it. You can see the wetness of it, but you can't see the fill. Um, so yeah, as in reference to what goes over the grain filler, okay, anything you rub on over it will not work because the grain filler is meant to penetrate the grain and seal the grains and pores so that whatever you put on top of it, less of it will be absorbed. Okay. If you're putting on a tung oil or a linseed oil and you're going to put on 12 or 15 coats with a rag, you're going to break down the grain filler, or the grain filler is going to break down the linseed oil, and it can cause some incompatibility. You have put linseed oil on it by brushing it over it, but it's the method of rubbing it in, causing great heat and friction, and you'll pull the grain filler oil. Will be an incompatibility issue. If you sprayed anything, it's fine. Water-based, solvent-based, oil-based, that's fine. Chris, you have another question?
I got a few.
Okay.
One of the questions is from Jim. On refinishing outdoors, I would strip, then wax free, then Aqua Coat.
You may not necessarily need the wax free. I would run a little test on the inside of a door. Um, you don't necessarily need the shellac unless you're trying to protect. The shellac is just there to protect the stain from bleeding through to what's on top of it. For instance, restoration people, if you had fire damage in your house, but you had smoke damage downstairs, it will smell like smoke forever. So what restoration people do is they'll take furniture, they'll give a little sand, and they'll put a shellac on it, and it'll seal it. Shellac is a great seal coat. It is not a great protective coat. You're still going to need stuff over it. So you don't necessarily need the shellac unless some woods are very oily. So if you need to protect the wood from, like the grain filler from wetting the wood, you could put a coat of shellac down, and you could also put a coat of sanding sealer down. Another question?
From Dan.
Hey,
How
Dan.
how deep of a crack can you fill?
Um, it says pour and clear, pour and grain. It's not a crack filler. Um, if you put it on a little thicker, in the sense of more than a 64th, it can look opaque. You know, people try filling knothole pine knots, and it will look opaque. In sense of your crack, if you want, you can take sawdust from the piece you're working on, add it to the grain filler, and it will take on that color of the sawdust, and you can repair the crack that way. I would not fill a crack more than a 30-second, because that if that wood continues to expand and contract, you could crack the coating. So yeah, so as long as you're not rubbing on your top coat, it'll work. There are people that have been able to do it um, with tung oil or linseed oil. They will apply a very thin coat and then sand it most of the grain filler out and leave very little. But that's the look they're looking for. They're not looking for a very high gloss. They're just looking for a little bit of fill. Okay.
Another question right now
Yes, please.
from Linda.
Morning, Linda. Good afternoon.
What is the best way, or she goes, I'm planning to do white cabinets in April. What is best way to keep prep before paint and avoid grain and bleeding?
Okay, so first off, if you're going to do the white cabinets, if you're going to paint, you definitely want to use the white cabinet grain filler. It will perform much better in less coats. Okay, and it'll make you more successful because you can see where you put it and where you didn't put it, and you can see where you sanded it and over sanded it. Your process would be clean your cabinets like Dawn and hot water and scrub them clean. Sand them to like a 150 or a 180. Apply a coat of grain filler, let it dry an hour or two. Stuff it with a 320 or 3 sandpaper. You're not trying to sand it down. You're not trying to sand it off. You're just trying to abrade it so that it sticks the next coat. And application's the same in both, except for you really can't even see where I put grain filler on here. You can see the shine, but you really can't see where it isn't. Um, you would apply your coat, let it dry an hour or two. The water base lays on top of each other, so you need to scuff it for the next coat to stick. Oil based or solvent based, literally it gets hot, hence the VOC. It forms a chemical reaction and burns itself and melts itself into the previous product. One coat, let it dry an hour or two, scuff it, apply another coat. You might need a third. I would run a test on the back of a drawer, put 2 coats and 3 coats, and then, 2 coats, let it dry overnight before you apply your primer and paint. You're going to need a tannin blocking primer for your paint. 2 coats of primer, 2 coats of paint.
From Greg, this must have been before when you were talking about staining and applying the grain filler. He says, how do you sand without ruining the stain?
Yeah, that's a great question. How do you sand the grain filler without going through and creating witness spots on the stain? So when I say you really don't need to sand much, I mean literally just applied that a couple minutes ago. It's relatively dry. You're not trying to sand it down. You're not trying to sand it off. You left an amount that you can barely see. You probably couldn't even see unless you had like a jeweler's loupe. Okay, so all you're trying to do is to abrade it so that the next coat sticks. Right? So once it's fully dry, literally, that's it. If you go more than that, you're over sanding it. And that's very obvious when you use the white that if you sand more than that, it literally removes it. Okay?
From Mimi, she has two questions here.
Okay.
Do you recommend I apply against the grain on the first coat primer and then against this grain on a second coat if needed, or do I primer first?
For the grain fillers, you really want to apply it against the grain, right? And then with the grain, take off the excess. You don't want to leave ridges. It's a derivative of a top coat, so it gets really hard pretty quick, right? And if you have ridges, and in the clear especially, they can telescope through, right? You'll be able to see them if you put your 4 coats of lacquer on or whatever your top coat is. Okay.
With the primer, she's asking about I think when she wants to use the primer.
You want to put the grain filler on, and then the primer.
And what primer is preferred?
Wax-free shellac, Your major stores will all have a version of it. Zinsser makes one, and there's another one. They're very common. They're all major boxes and all paint stores and woodworking stores will have them also.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
Um, from Tim.
Hey, Tim?
Must you also do a sealer all over the top of the grain filler before water-based top coat?
No. Your water-based top coat will adhere. You might want to do a sanding sealer, which you would probably do anyway. You would still do the same planned process and the same planned amount of coats, but as the grain filler is, you're not, your objective is not to build the grain filler up and then get a glass smooth finish with the grain filler before you apply your top coats. Your objective is to build it down into the grains and pores and seal and block the grains and pores so that whatever you put on top of it will puddle up and level out and fill. You don't necessarily want to do it that way.
I got one more question here, and then maybe we can go to you showing how some boards were tinted with the
Okay.
green color.
Okay.
Monica, is there a top coat to avoid on top of aqua coat?
It'll accept water base, it'll accept oil based. It's more of the method of application. Ideally, you want to spray it. That will leave a much richer, much clearer, much more professional look. You know, if you're brushing it, you want to use a synthetic if you're using a water-based top coat, you want to use a good quality synthetic brush. We also carry top coats or manufacture top coats. So you could use a lacquer is very nice. The aquathane is very nice. As for top coats to go over the grain filler. And that's available at our website at www.aquacoat.com. And another question?
Greg has a question. He must have said something about shellac instead of you must have mentioned you use shellac instead of a good primer like bullseye.
Yep, bullseye. That's another one of them. That's another primer-based product.
Okay.
And well, I'm going to put some grain filler on. I kind of grain filled this and didn't grain fill that. So we're going to put a little on. This is some grain filler we colored with some pigments for some of the stains we make. I recommend using gloves. And you can, and with this, you can put it on with your fingers in a glove and get it into the grains. And then, wipe off the excess. It's kind of like a gel stain, except for it seals the grains and pores. Thank you, Vanna. How nice that looks, right? Put it on, wipe it off, how it accentuates the grain. That's what that looks like with the grain filler in it. And it's really cool. You can do it with with the white. You can add some black and make it gray, right? And you can put like gray backdrop look in the grains like that, and then put a clear coat over it. Um, this is, yeah, this is another look at that. It's kind of a different, but that's the same color, kind of more left on longer. I wiped it off relatively fast. The longer you leave it on, the more of it's going to penetrate. I left that other part on for 4 or 5 more minutes and then wiped it off. It'll be a little darker, and yeah, very easy. You saw how easy it was to apply. Great for art projects and stuff like that. Other questions?
Not at the moment.
Okay, so if you have any more questions, we'd be glad to answer them. If you have any shelf life greater than a year, passes 3 freestyle cycles. There's so many different things you can do with it. People use it they get nicks in wood. And if you have a really big nick and you fill it with the grain filler, it'll look opaque. So they'll take sawdust from that species of wood and they'll make their own little container of, let's say they're using walnut. They'll make their own sawdust and add it and keep a little sub kit of it, a little sub piece of it. And every time they got to touch up, they'll use it as a touch up. I did have a guy come to me at a trade show from a store, and a woodworking store, and he had drilled a hole through his board. It was oak, and he said, "Can you find?" I nailed a hole, pushed a nail all the way through and pulled it out the other side. Can you? This is done. Can you see where I did it? And I didn't. He said I took the sawdust from this piece, mixed it with the grain filler, patched the hole, and clear coated it. And then he turned it over, and it was literally a hole the size of a. You can do that. Use it for a like that.
Um, got a few more questions here, Brian.
Yep.
Um, for the tinting, we have two questions on the tinting of the grain filler. Should all the coats of the grain filler be dyed or tinted, or just the first one?
Hmm, that's a good.
That's a good question.
So every time you tint it and add it, it will alter the color, right? It will get darker. So it'll be so if you put a coat on with tint in it, coat of the grain filler on with tint in it. Uh, First off, I want to say thank you, everybody. You guys are asking some great questions. If you put a with colorant in it and then you put another coat on it, it will become darker. So what you might want to do is just put that first coat on, maybe light, not quite the color, the darkness, the depth you want in color, and then put more of that of the grain filler over the top of it with the colorant in it. Or you could probably put colorant layer down first, let it dry, a coat of shellac, right, and then grain filler over the top of that. Or maybe just clear first and then probably just the clear grain filler first and then the colored coat over it. Not much of it's going to penetrate. That's a good question. That's another one to ask our chemist.
We'll get back to you, Tim, on that one.
We'll get back to you. Thanks, Tim.
Mimi, do you recommend mixing it with water and brushing it on? Probably the tinted,
Um,
maybe.
you could brush it on. You could use it as like a gel stain. Um, if you add the color you want, you could see how that kind of turned out. Um, I, the brushing, it's not going to get it in the pore. It needs to be forced in, like this or like a credit card, that type of thing. Some people use squeegees on big projects, on big tables. I prefer smaller areas because it dries very fast. So you want to kind of slow that down and do it to little areas first. Thank you, Mimi.
Greg, what pigments do you tint it with? And how about dye, like trans tint versus pigment?
Both of them will work. Pigments will work. Trans dyes will work. They just have to be water soluble. And what you could do is you kind of want to wet your colorant first, right? You want to put it in its own self container with very, very, very hot water and a very minimal amount, right? And stir it in. Most pigment is or dyes are very, very concentrated. So put some in and then take your sub container of the grain filler, take a tablespoon out, put it in another container, put a couple of drops of dye in there, stir it up, and if it's not dark enough, put some out on your wood. Not dark enough, add a little more, or if it's too dark, add a little more grain filler. But you want to wet the pigments or the dyes or the trans tints first. A little bit of hot water, really hot. The hotter it is, and you stir it, the easier it'll break up. Okay. We have to give one more away. You want to?
Yep. So if Monica, you were the first one before, please send an email to sales@aquacoat.com and we will send you a free quart of the clear grain filler. Tim Murray, also, same thing. Why don't you send an email to sales@aquacoat.com with your information, both Monica and Tim, with your address, phone number, and we will send you a quart.
And if you have any questions I didn't get to, always feel free to send us an email. We can answer them at sales@aquacoat.com also.
Or you can comment and post them on this live feed and we'll answer them there too.
Yeah, we'll come back and answer those. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it, and happy filling.